Well, once again, friends, welcome to Foundation Church. My name is John. I'm the pastor here, and today we are concluding a series that we started at the beginning of this month entitled Dinner with Jesus. This is a message series built around various meals that Jesus had with various different people. And the meal that we're going to be looking at today is often referred to as Jesus' Last Supper, his final meal before the resurrection with his followers. But in that meal, as we're going to learn, Jesus talked about what it really means to be a servant or true servanthood. To help us get into that conversation, though, I have what is kind of a heavy question. So I apologize right from the start. This is a more serious question. It's going to require some perhaps thought and maybe even make you feel a thing or two. I'm sorry. But the question that I want you to explore and then to share your answer with somebody around you is, who would you want to share your last meal with? Who would you want to share your last meal with? Take a second and share with somebody around you. Okay. Hopefully it didn't require a lot of thought. My guess is for a lot of you, you immediately knew the answer or answers, the person or people, pretty quickly. But perhaps thinking about the prospect of your last meal was a little depressing, so I'm super sorry. For me, it didn't take me any thought at all. It required no time. I knew immediately that I wanted to spend my last meal, if I could choose, with my family. And for me, my family is for sure my wife and my 3 children, although if I had my druthers, I would expand it out to my parents and my grandparents, and I'd bring in some close friends and some other relatives that once in a while I don't mind, and maybe even a few of my closest church people as well. So I would expand and expand and expand and expand, and my wife would constantly say, "This is too many people. I don't care that it's your last meal, we're not doing it." But it's funny about lasts. Now, the reality is we often don't know when it's going to be our last time, either our last time for a season or our last time forever. We don't get that luxury. But when we do, a lot of emphasis gets put on it, right? It really matters what we say and the way we act. We don't want to do or say something that's going to leave a sour taste in our mouth. We would even, for instance, in my case, if we were preparing my last meal, spend a lot of time focusing in on what we would eat. And there would be some things we would eat because I love it, and there would be some things we wouldn't eat even though I love them, because other people around me don't. So, for example, I love garlic. I love it a ton. Like, I love to eat so much garlic that it, comes out of my skin. Like, days later, people are like, "Did you eat garlic?" And I'm like, "Yeah, last Thursday. It was amazing." But it turns out my wife really, really hates it when I eat so much garlic. It's oozing out of my pores. And so I know for sure my last meal wouldn't involve garlic. Now, while I said a lot of times we don't know these things, Jesus was aware of his last meal. He knew that was to be his final meal. And instead of saying, "I want to be with my mom and my siblings," he chose to be with his followers. And of all the things that Jesus could have talked about and taught about, he chose to teach his disciples one last time what true servanthood looks like. And that's the story we're going to be looking at today. To help us do that, we're going to be reading from John's Gospel, John chapter 13, verses 1 to 5. Now, it is true, this is the last meal that Jesus had before his crucifixion. If we were to keep reading the story, we would see that Jesus would die, and then he would rise again, and then he would share meals with people after. But this was the last one before that. Again, I'm reading John 13, 1 to 5. It was just before the Passover festival. Jesus knew that the hour had come for him to leave this world and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. The evening meal was in progress, and the devil had already prompted Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, to betray Jesus. Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power, and that he had come from God and was returning to God. So he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, and wrapped a towel around his waist. After that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around him. This is God's word. It's given freely for each and every one of you. I want to take you back to verse 1. In verse 1, we're being told that this was just before the Passover festival, right? The author is giving us some context, some time and place. It's just before the Passover festival. Now, for the Jews, Passover was a time that they remembered and celebrated their liberation from slavery in Egypt. Because of the timing of this meal with Jesus and his followers, for Christians, for thousands of years after, this meal is a reminder and a celebration of our liberation, not from slavery in Egypt, but slavery to sin. Jesus, he reinterpreted this meal and said that this is for us to be liberated, to remember that we are liberated. Now, the story doesn't stop there. It moves on in verse 3. In verse 3, we're told that Jesus knew that God had put all things under his power and that he had come from God and was returning to God. In other words, Jesus knew this was his final meal, and he knew that he had this incredible authority or power. As a matter of fact, the literal translation there is that everything had been put into his hands, like he had it in the palm of his hands. And this got me thinking of all the things that Jesus chose to do. When he was told, this is the end, and you have all authority, all power, all ability, everything's in your hands. Well, it got me thinking, what would I do? And I'm curious what you would do, and so that's where I want to ask you our second question, and that is, what would you do if you had power over all things, over everything? Now, in a second, I'm going to invite you to take a moment and share with somebody around you, but I got to be honest, I'm guessing that perhaps some rules or some laws might change. Maybe even some people or some places might be modified slightly, but take a second and share with somebody around you what you would do if you had power over all things. All right, this is you did not talk very much. This must not be very exciting for you. I have to be honest, I have like a laundry list, but number one on my list, I was talking to somebody about this the other day and they didn't believe me. Number one on my list, I would not have to wear a seatbelt ever again. I know, it's silly, right? Like, you still have to wear them because it's good for you. It'll keep you safe, but I hate them. I don't care. So if I had power, no seatbelt for John, and my car wouldn't beep when I didn't wear my seatbelt. That's number one on my list. But here's the thing. Jesus didn't do that. He didn't change any of the rules. As a matter of fact, we're told in verse 5 what he does. See, in verse 5, we're told that Jesus poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with a towel. See, he had power to do anything, and he knew this was the end. And yet he chose to wash feet. Now, this may be something that you're familiar with. Maybe you've even experienced foot washing in some kind of religious context or in some other context where somebody else washes your feet. Just informally show of hands. How many of you have ever had another person wash your feet? Yeah, so hardly any hands. Hardly any hands. Online people, there's like 4 hands. Let me tell you, I have had this happen more than a few times. I've gotten to wash people's feet. I've had people wash my feet. It's awkward, and it's a little uncomfortable. It feels a little weird. Now, for a modern person, this isn't something that we need to have happen. In the ancient world, this was a necessity. Remember that people weren't wearing awesome Brooks sneakers like me. They were often wearing open-toed shoes or no shoes. They didn't have amazing running water and modern sewage and septic systems, waste removal. They walked in it, through it, and around it everywhere, all the time, especially in an urban environment. And so when you would come somewhere, your feet would not just be dusty and dirty. They would be really dirty, and they would need to be washed. It was a must, and it was always a job reserved for a servant, for a slave, for somebody who was beneath you. And so the shock and the horror that Jesus chose with all the power to do that for his followers at his last meal with them was profound. He chose to do this because Jesus chose to serve. He chose to serve them. to teach them not simply with his words, but with his actions. True servanthood. This comes as a call, as a reminder, and as a challenge for each and every one of us. If we were to have continued reading the story that we read from today, we would have gotten to verse 14, where in verse 14, Jesus made it clear, now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. Christians for 2,000 years have not taken this as just instruction for those gathered in that room on that night, but rather as instruction for all who've come after, who claim to follow Jesus, to also be servants of one another. The reality is, though, you heard me say that foot washing in the modern world is kind of awkward. It's uncomfortable. And it's not super necessary. You see, in the ancient world, it was a need. It was a necessity. It was simple. Anyone could do it, but it was humbling. It required humility. And so it got me thinking, what is the modern equivalent of foot washing? What is the thing that you and I, any of us can do, many of us aren't willing to do, or if we do, it forces us to become humble, and best of all, not only helps us to put others first, but helps us to wipe away some of the dirt and the grime that the world has put upon them. It may make sense to you, it may shock you, but the answer I came upon is listening. It turns out that most of us don't need somebody to wash our feet, but many of us need somebody to listen. Not simply to hear, but truly to listen, to care, to understand, to have someone put us before themselves. I'm going to suggest to you that listening is the act that you can practice to model true servanthood, to follow that call that Jesus gave us. Now, in a minute, we're going to talk about the best listener you know, but I want to be clear that all of us can become better, and none of us are perfect at this. But I do want you to share with everyone around you who is the best listener you know, the best listener in your life. Go ahead and take a second and share with someone around you. Okay. Hopefully you got a chance to share at least a name or two. Now, here's the reality. I am super blessed with like a bunch of phenomenal listeners. I'm surrounded by them. And I could list off all the names of all the really, really good listeners that I encounter in my life, but instead I wanted to go in a different direction, a little more scandalous, and share with you the worst listener I know. I know it's shocking. I'm going to name names. As a matter of fact, in a moment, not yet, in a moment, I even have a picture of this person. Are you ready? Go ahead, let's throw that picture up there. Yeah, you may be noticing there's not a picture. It's me. I'm maybe the worst listener I know. I'm really, really bad at this. So sometimes people will talk to me and I will say things like, I really care about what you're saying, but I need you to send me this in writing because I will forget it. Certainly on Sunday morning, I'm a really, really awful listener. I have got 100 things in my mind and I've got 100 places I want to go. But it turns out that I am not a gifted listener. It does not come natural to me. I don't know if anyone else does this, but oftentimes when people are talking to me, I find myself getting distracted. Like either distracted with my phone or distracted with a TV or distracted with a person around me or distracted with a blade of grass on the ground. It doesn't matter. I don't need a lot, but getting distracted. The other thing I often do is I find myself thinking about what I want to say next before they're done talking. Does anyone else experience that? You begin to think about what you're going to say. Now, this doesn't just happen when I'm having an argument with someone. This happens all the time. It's terrible. So I know I'm a profoundly poor listener. And yet I know that each and every one of us can become better listeners. And so that's what I want to offer to you today is 3 steps. These are simple, they are easy. 3 steps to help you become a better listener. Again, realizing that at least I'm suggesting that listening is the modern day foot washing. It is the way that we can serve one another and help wash off some of the dirt and the grime that the world forces on us. It is the way that we can humble ourselves and begin to put others first and follow the lead of Jesus. So step number 1 is really easy. Remove distractions. This can be as simple as putting your phone in your pocket, not having it on the table or in your hand. This can be as simple as turning off the television when somebody is talking to you, or just pausing the TV. A lot of us stream things, just pause it. Don't have it keep running, or mute it if you have to. A really simple tip, and this used to be a huge problem for Crystal and I when we were first dating, is we would go places to restaurants, and I like to think of myself as this rugged man. I'm not, but I like to think that way, like tough guy, right? And so I would sit so I could see the door. I would sit facing the door with my back to the back wall so I could protect her if danger came. Really, all it did, though, is it served to distract me, because every time a new person would come in or a person would leave, I would notice, and my darling wife would be talking to me, and I would just be distracted. And I'm like, oh, look, there's a squirrel running across the street. I need to notice that. And so what I've started doing is when Crystal and I go on dates, I realize I'm not rugged and tough, and somebody else will be rugged and tough, and I sit facing the back wall or the side wall, so I am the least distracted. I don't know what that looks like for you, but remove distractions when you're trying to listen. Number 2 is simply to not rehearse or think about your response. Now, I know for some of us this is difficult because our memories are faulty, and so we think, well, if I don't think about my response, I'll forget it. Or if I don't think through what I'm going to say, I won't say it right. But instead, just simply listen when the other is talking. Again, this can be really serious conversations and really small and simple ones. Simply listen, and then when they're done talking, take a moment and think through what you want to say, instead of thinking through while they're talking. The final tip, and this is maybe the hardest one for me to put into practice sometimes, but maybe the most important, is number 3, and that is ask questions. The reality is that our minds, you may not know this, your mind thinks about 4 times faster than any person speaks. And so it's easy for us to jump from A to B to C to D, and the person is still on A. We get ahead of ourselves. Sometimes we think we know where the conversation is going, and that's not at all where it's going. And so to help slow ourselves down, to make sure we actually understand, and to show some interest in the person we're talking to, ask questions. Are you saying this? Do you mean that? A great way to ask these questions is to repeat their words back to them. That's also super duper helpful. Now look, these are 3 simple steps. These are not exclusive from me. I did not make these up. This came from the Harvard Business Review as a December 12th, 2021 article. You can totally look it up and read it if you want. It's got, I think, 7 or 8. These are 3 that I thought were the best, the most meaningful, the most valuable. The reality is, again, listening is serving. It is caring. It is supporting others. And again, listening is following that example that Jesus gave to us, where Jesus said, this is what really matters. Maybe a good way to put this, or to remind us of this, is to say that Jesus is calling us into service. He's calling us to serve one another. There are a whole host of ways we can do this. We can literally take strangers on the street and pull their socks and shoes off and start to wash them. Although I'm going to suggest that would be weird and they wouldn't receive it well. You can literally go and sit and listen quietly to people, care about what they're saying, engage with them on a level that is meaningful to them. Or you can find some other way to serve. I'm not trying to be prescriptive here, but I am trying to say that we are called to serve not just each other here, but everyone, everywhere. Again, we've been talking about dinners with Jesus. We've looked at just 4 of them. 4 meals that Jesus had with people that, honestly, some of whom followed him and some of whom criticized him. And yet there's a depth, a wealth of knowledge that we can gain from that. Today we were talking about true servanthood, the need to really, truly serve. And again, if you remember nothing else, I want you to remember that Jesus is calling us into service, and that looks like putting others first, putting others before ourselves. Pray with me if you would. God, as we go through what sometimes feels like busy, chaotic, turbulent lives, remind us that it's not always all about us. That's not just what we want or what we need, but that you've called us to serve others, to put others before ourselves, to learn from your example, and to follow your lead. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.